Hello everyone, I'm Darcy Bono, and I'm proud to present to you the Garbage Pail Kids of 40k, the Death Guard. In this video, you're going to learn how you can very easily paint that weathered bronze trim, the vibrant green armor, as well as a few fun and easy tricks you can use to make your Death Guard look more disgusting, and we're going to be doing this using mostly contrast paints. So that being said, let's get started. We're starting with a mini that's been primed to Mechanicus standard gray, but any mid-tone gray will work. Now if you'd like a darker color scheme with deeper shadows, feel free to use black. However, I prefer gray just because it makes it a little bit easier to work with these transparent contrast paints and will ultimately result in shadows that actually have a color to them, so they're not just black, and then you can adjust this hue accordingly, and we're going to go into that in just a little bit. So once your miniature has been primed, you're now ready to set up your highlights, and we're going to be doing this by dry brushing using a light gray, such as Gray Seer, and a rounded tip makeup brush. And with any dry brushing, make sure you get most of the paint off your brush and test your stroke on another surface before applying it. Now, you may have heard of this process before. On the internet, it's known as slap chop. I grew up with it being called undershading, and if you're from the Renaissance, it's called grisaille. So it's an old technique where basically you just establish your highlights and shadows first before applying a tint to your miniature. So just dry brush your miniature all over using a light gray. And if you'd like a more rugged, textured look to your armor, which is great for Death Guard, target some of the more smoother surfaces with stippling. Stippling is basically just the cousin of dry brushing, where you get most of the paint off your brush, and then you lightly jab at it with the tip of the brush. This is also why we're using a rounded tip makeup brush, because it has very densely packed bristles, so you'll get this controlled speckled pattern that's going to give the armor a bit more of a worn look once we apply our contrast paint. So this is what your miniature should look like once your undershading is complete. And yes, it's going to look dusty and chalky, but do not worry, it's going to be smoothed out just fine once we apply our contrast paint. Now you're going to notice in the next footage, I jump right to the green. I was excited because I like painting green, I like painting vibrant colors, but do not do this. If you're new to the hobby or you're not comfortable with your brush control yet, paint your metallics and paint your trim before you do the green armor. This way you don't get any metallic flake on your nice green armor once it's complete. This will just save you a lot of headache in the long run. So I happen to have this pauldron from my Slaves to Darkness that already had the undershading as well as the trim done. The trim is just Leadbelcher. It's a base coat of Leadbelcher, and we're going to turn it bronze using Wyldwood brown. First thing we're going to do though is lay down a layer of Lahmian Medium. If you've seen my videos before, you know why I do this. This actually helps the paint diffuse and makes the surface wet, so it's easier to spread it out, especially over flatter surfaces like the back of this pauldron here. Immediately after I apply the contrast paint, I rinse my brush and then just use the damp brush to smooth it out. And we're using this instead of contrast medium just because it provides a little bit more fluidity. It just allows you to spread it more easily than with contrast medium. It does a better job than water as well, because water makes it flow a bit too much. It makes it a little harder to control. So I prefer using Lahmian Medium for this trick. So just apply that, immediately followed by Wyldwood brown while it's still wet, smooth it out with a damp brush, and then let it dry, and you'll have a nice dark bronze. Now, if you'd like, you can edge highlight with something like Canoptic Alloy, though for Death Guard edge highlights, you don't really need that bright shining surface, but if you want it, Canoptic Alloy is a good choice. Now, I'm going to show you how to weather this a little bit if you want a weathered bronze. If you want to skip ahead to the green, feel free. We're pretty much done with our trim from here, but this is how you weather bronze using just contrast paint. We're going to do our same Lahmian Medium trick, but only in the recesses. Don't coat the entire surface. This will cause the paint to sink into only where that Lahmian Medium is. So while that's still wet, you're then going to apply Gryph Charger Gray. This is a bluish green gray that gives a nice, weird, weathered tinge to your bronze armor. And it's also going to provide a more natural color transition for when we lay down our brighter teal patina, or patina, depending on where you're from. So we've got a somewhat mottled tinge to our bronze. We're going to go ahead and do the exact same trick we did before, just a speck of Lahmian Medium just over the rivets, and then we're going to apply Briar Queen Chill. And then you lightly feather out the edges. You can always, if you find out you've put too much on there, just rinse your brush and wipe it up. Wipe away the edges and it'll look much more natural. So just continue to apply Briar Queen Chill all around the rivets, and then use a damp brush to feather out the edges. So that's how to paint the weathered bronze trim, and now we're ready to move on to the fun green armor. So just ignore the fact the trim isn't done. Again, I shot this out of sequence. I should have done the trim first, but just apply Mantis Warrior Green straight from the pot all over your armor. Try to avoid your painted trim. But if you do get some of this on your trim, it's totally fine. It is a lighter, transparent color that really isn't going to show up very well against a darker bronze, and it's also very easy to wipe away while it's still wet. And one of the reasons I love painting Death Guard is because you don't have to worry about pooling. Contrast paint is notorious for pooling. There are ways around that, again, as I showed with the Lahmian Medium trick that helps you spread things out more evenly, but you can be fairly lackadaisical with this. Just don't completely drench your miniature, but if the Death Guard have splotches on them, then you're just painting to character. So go ahead and just apply Mantis Warrior Green all over your undershading. Really quick before we get to the next step, I wanted to point out why I don't use Plague Bearer Flesh. Everyone always asks, can I use this on my Death Guard? I personally don't like it because it is entirely too transparent, it's way too fluid, and it just kind of pulls in on itself without actually tinting the whole surface. So this is what it looks like if you apply Plague Bearer Flesh over top of undershading. And right now, to the camera, while it's still wet, it looks pretty similar to Mantis Warrior Green, but once it dries, it's just too much of that undershading showing through, so that's why I prefer Mantis Warrior Green. And once the Mantis Warrior Green has dried, it'll look like this. Now this looks really intense. I can feel the eyebrows being raised over this, but don't worry, we're gonna knock this down to a gross olive green, and to do that, all we're gonna do is apply Targor Rageshade straight out the pot. So there's really not much to this, just apply this over the miniature, and what I'm about to say next is completely optional. It's just for if you want slightly different hues to your shadows. A common rule of thumb in painting is that you have warm highlights and cool shadows. It creates contrast, it makes it just a little more interesting, but you don't have to do it. If you'd like to do it, don't apply this Targor Rageshade in your most shadowed areas like the inside of his shin here. Just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to leave the inside of his right shin relatively untouched. And I'm going to coat the inside of his left so you can see the color difference once we're done. So here's what the miniature looks like once the Targor Rageshade has completely dried. As you can see, the inside of that right shin has not had the same color saturation as the one on the left. I'm now going to apply Gryph Charger Gray, the same blue-green gray that we used for our deep weathered bronze, and I'm just going to line the most shadowed portions. Gryph Charger Gray has blue in it. Blue is a cool color, therefore we get cool green shadows, which gives us nice color contrast compared to the bright, warm green. Creating this variation between warm and cool tones is just a very simple, beginner-friendly way of making your painting look a little more interesting. So that is my foundation for painting green Death Guard armor. If you want to enhance this a little more with like an edge highlight or some chipping, you just need a slightly lighter hue than the main surface. In this case, I'm just doing a simple edge highlight using Orruk Flesh. You can also use this color to do some basic chipping, where you apply it with a sponge. Make sure to get most of the paint off your sponge first, test your pattern, and then lightly press it to the miniature. And the final part that makes this trick really work is adding some depth to these scratches by using a red brown, such as Cygor brown. You're going to repeat the process, just lightly dab that red brown over your light green scratches, and now you have some lightly chipped armor. And speaking of chipping, let's go ahead and cover how to do some very basic weathering techniques using contrast paints. Now, everyone has their own favorite type of weathering process. My husband loves using oils. Some people like using Dirty Down Rust and other products similar to that. I honestly love using contrast paints because I can use them on a variety of other non-weathering related projects like leather and fabric and hair. So this is my arsenal of weathering related contrast paints. This is a cheat sheet. Feel free to take a screenshot. I'm going to cover it very quickly because honestly, weathering is just not my favorite. So this is basically a synopsis of what they are and what I use them for. So let's see them all in action. This weapon has just been very, very heavily dry brushed using Leadbelcher over a black surface. That's it. That's all we did to get to this point. If you want things to look extra dingy, just do some very light stippling over black. The black underlayer will show through a little bit more, but I made this especially bright just because I knew I was going to be doing multiple layers of contrast paint over top. First up, we have Ratling Grime. This is a great brownish gray color that's fantastic for making things look very like industrial metal, but not fully rusted over. As you can see, it is quite a dark brown when applied densely. The more thinly you apply it, the more that metal underlayer will show through. Apply more of it if you want a grungy dark brown metal, or apply it thinly if you just want a slight brownish hue. For a deep dingy brass, you can use Garaghak Seer, and I apologize for not hitting the record button hard enough when I went to apply this, but this is what it looks like over silver. This was applied straight out the pot, but again, same concept as Ratling Grime. The more thinly you apply it, the lighter the color is going to be. Next up, we have our Jack of all trades contrast paint when it comes to weathering, and I'm using Black Legion mixed with Lahmian Medium in an even ratio. Black Legion is a brown-black, but it is very opaque, so do not use this straight out the pot if you actually want to see the silver underlayer. And again, if you do want this more black, feel free to let this dry and apply another coat, or honestly, you can be pretty messy with it and go ahead and just apply another layer while it's still wet. So that is what it looks like when it's more densely applied, so just flavor it to taste. And as it is a brown black, you can also use it to deepen the color of any of the other, quote, weathering contrast paints that we're using. For example, this ring here, this deeper bronze color was used with the same Garaghak sewer as before, but just with a pinch of Black Legion mixed into it. We're going to move on to our more copper tones by using Gorgrunta Fur. This is Gorgrunta Fur with just a, again, tiny pinch of Black Legion. You get a kind of burnt umber color. That's what I'm putting on this tiny little exhaust pipe here. By itself, it makes a much brighter copper, but if you apply it over a grungy silver, it won't be quite as vibrant. So I'm going to do these coils using Gorgrunta Fur, and you end up with a dull industrial copper. And for our final contrast paint color, I'm applying Cygor Brown over a wet layer of Lahmian Medium. Same trick as we used before in the bronze trim earlier in the video. Cygor Brown is a reddish brown that looks great when applied in the recesses as it resembles old rust. And we're applying this over the Lahmian Medium as it helps it to diffuse so you can feather out the edges. So with our industrial weathering done, let's move on to what I think is the infinitely more fun part, and that is the gross factor. So I'm going to show you just a couple simple tricks to give your Death Guard more of a nasty flavor. The first is making any area where you have like a bone or a horn erupting out of the armor, make that fissure look fleshy. And I like doing that because the Death Guard power armor is basically like one with their bodies now. There's literally a part in the Lords of Silence where a guy can't take his helmet off because it has become his head, essentially. So just paint the ridges of these fissures using an ivory. In this case, I used Morghast bone. To get that fun fleshy hue, all I'm going to do is apply a layer of Carroburg Crimson Shade straight from the pot. And there's really nothing else to this, just apply this over your ivory. You don't really even need to worry about it getting on the green because if it does, it just makes kind of a brown color, which is fine for the Death Guard. So just apply that here and let it dry. And I realized I forgot to mention how I painted that horn. All I did was apply Lahmian Medium over a white base coat. Then I applied Skeleton Horde Contrast very heavily. The Lahmian Medium will help it flow into the recesses as we want those to be the most saturated. Once it was dry, I then repeated the process, but this time using Ratling Grime so it sinks into the very bottom to give us a dark, nasty brown. I then added a highlight and some striations using Ushabti bone and a fine detail brush. So let's get back to painting gross fleshy stuff. This is my go-to process for painting any kind of tentacles or guts or anything that looks squishy. This is just Morghast bone applied over our original Mechanicus standard gray base. I'm just dry brushing and stippling it on until it's fairly densely coated. So once you've got your ivory over top of your gray, you're then going to, once again, coat this in Lahmian Medium, just because this is a very smooth surface. Not that pooling would look out of place on this thing, but just so it smooths out, you'll see again that this makes it much easier. So this is Carroburg Crimson Shade straight from the pot. You can also use Volpus Pink, but I recommend thinning it in about an even ratio with Lahmian Medium, just because it can be very vibrant, and you don't want this to look like bubblegum. Though, come to think of it, used bubblegum is really disgusting when you see it on pavement, so that actually could be a good idea. But anyway, this is just Carroburg Crimson Shade very heavily applied over top of this, and again the Lahmian Medium allows us to smooth it out where it becomes more saturated. And for the grand finale, we'll paint these boils to look so disgusting they look like a souvenir from a wild night in Vegas. We're going to start with a white base coat because we want a bit more vibrancy. Then I'm going to apply Skeleton Horde Contrast straight from the pot, and then wipe away the center, so that way it's lightly tinted, but most of it is pushed down into the recesses. This is going to allow for greater color saturation in our recesses, which is going to make a much grosser looking boil, and you'll see what I mean in just a sec. Once the Skeleton Horde has dried, you can just go ahead and put Carroburg Crimson Shade over top and do the exact same process, wipe away the center. I also wanted to mention this is exactly how I did the growth on his pauldron as well as that bit on his upper chest. It was also at this point I realized that these are larger and smoother than I thought they were going to be, so we should be using our Lahmian Medium trick to help create a less patchy color gradient. So let's try that again. We're going to apply Lahmian Medium over top of this, and then apply our Carroburg Crimson Shade, which then diffuses into the recesses and is just much easier to spread around. And really quick, just so you can see the color difference, I'm applying Lahmian Medium to this boil, and then I'm applying Volpus Pink that's been thinned with Lahmian Medium just because it's usually very saturated. Just so you can see the color difference, I like both of them. I think the Volpus Pink actually makes it look more inflamed because it's a more saturated color. So from here, you can just let them dry, and if you want to add an extra layer of yuck to them, you can paint a white head in the center of this just by using a dot of Wraithbone. And in this case, I didn't thin my paint at all. I literally just scooped it out of the pot because I want that raised textured white chunk in the center of this. And at the end of the day, I decided I did want these a little more inflamed, so I'm just adding Volpus Pink in here. And if you want these to look more bloody, you can actually mix in just a tiny pinch of Skeleton Horde into your Volpus Pink. It warms it up and makes it more of like a fresh scab color. It's very gross, but in this case, I'm just using Volpus Pink. And one final step I did off screen just as an afterthought, I did add a gloss varnish to these to give them a slimy, I don't want that anywhere near me look. So just an optional bit of yuck you can add to your boils. So that is it. That's how to paint a Plague Marine using mostly contrast paints. And you may notice there are some things on here I didn't cover in the video, like the little tubes and the pus dripping out, just little things here and there that were going to add up and be pretty tedious because it's just a coat of a contrast paint over gray Seer repeatedly, basically. So there's actually recipes for that in my Ko-fi link, just a general synopsis of all the small little details on here. Check that out in the video description. That's also where you can find more Death Guard tutorials, including how to paint filthy, moldy fabric, as well as a rusty weapon tutorial, and more importantly, how to make that disgusting crusty stuff on the back of his tank as well as the base itself. And if you really enjoyed this video and want to support the channel as well as me as an artist, you can hit the super thanks button in the YouTube interface. It basically functions as a tip jar, and any support is greatly appreciated. So thanks very much for joining me, and until we meet again, happy painting, everyone.